So tonight we got error boundaries, server-side rendering, progressive web apps. I know you guys are most excited about error boundaries. They're a pretty big deal, right? I can sense the excitement in the room. No, honestly, I didn't care about error boundaries at all. I never really had to deal with errors and stuff in React at all until very recently. The product I've been working on at work is this pluggable system that lives inside the React render lifecycle. So if the plugins throw, we need to be able to recover gracefully from that and not crash our entire application just because somebody else's code doesn't work. It turns out we write buggy code too, so it's nice for us as well. So before I get into error boundaries proper, I want to just talk about error handling in general. So this being the advanced talk, I assume everybody in here knows try-catch. Effectively, you're going to try to do something, that thing might fail and catch. You should do something with the error, but effectively it's just kind of a way to recover from that error, right? In React, because React is, as we know, basically just JavaScript, effectively what we want to be able to do is this. In our render function, do a try on some component, and if that fails, render something else instead, right? So there it is, we're done. Thanks for coming out. Can anybody venture to guess why this doesn't work? Wow, nobody, okay. So there's two reasons that React is fast. One is the whole virtual DOM thing, right? It pre-renders everything in memory, compares it, only makes the changes in the DOM that it has to make. The other reason that it's fast is that it's batching those changes. So when a bunch of components are updating, it's not constantly clobbering the DOM and trying to update things. It's waiting for things to kind of settle down, and it does all those things, all those changes in one shot. So while your components, your render function, all that stuff has to be synchronous, behind the scenes, React is actually asynchronous. So what you're really doing, it doesn't look like it, but this is effectively what you have, is you're running some sort of asynchronous thing. This code doesn't work, right? Because now I'm in some sort of asynchronous pipeline. The try won't do anything. The thing that gets returned isn't actually the error. Like, the error happens later. So in order to get error handling in React, we have to kind of react up the try-catch loop a little bit. One way we can do this is to have just kind of custom wrapper and basically pass in our own on-error handler. So what we have here is, a little bit of local state. I have this on-error function that basically just sets the error state to some error instead of false, which is the default. When there is an error, I render some safe component. Otherwise, I render the component that might fail, and I pass in the error handler. The problem with this is now the component, if it fails, it needs to know it's going to fail to call that function, right? Which gets you kind of most of the way there, but if there's something wrong with the code, maybe you're reaching into an object that isn't the shape that you think it is or something, the code's just going to throw, you're not going to know that it's supposed to throw. You can't try catch in your own code because, again, React is asynchronous, or at least the rendering pipeline of it is. And so this really isn't a solution. So I did a little bit of Googling before error boundaries were a thing. Error boundaries are new in React 16, if you did not know that. Previous to that, the kind of only way that I could find to do that was to write a custom batching strategy. Did anybody know that you could write a custom batching strategy in React? You did, because you kind of, when I was asking about it, you're like, hey, you can do this. And I was like, yeah, I found that already. So yeah, so not only is React kind of like bundling all these changes up and firing them off sometime later when things settle down, but you can actually write your own strategy for how that works. And as part of that strategy, you can listen for an error to have been thrown somewhere and catch it and basically do something with it, right? So this requires you to maybe bind something to a window on error, or using Redux, or some other global state management thing, push that error up into the state so that the rest of the application can see, oh, hey, something failed. It's kind of a roundabout way to solve the problem. This does handle the throwing situation, though. If the code that you're trying to render in the render pipeline throws, this will catch it. But it's not exactly elegant, right? What we really want to do is get as close to that kind of try-catch situation as we can. Again, whoops. This is sort of the ideal, right? We try to render something, it throws, and we render something else instead. With error boundaries, we do get to do that. So what React 16 introduced was this component dig catch. And effectively how this works is if something in the render pipeline throws, this lifecycle gets called, and you can do, again, we have some local state, we can catch that error and render something else instead. But you notice that in the component that might throw, I'm not passing in it's like magical error handling or anything. All I need to do is wrap my component tree in an error boundary, and we can have as many of these as you want, and it'll basically bubble up to the component that has this component dig catch lifecycle, and that's effectively the way that you can catch that error. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions about that? I honestly don't know. I only have a single error boundary in mind. I only know so much, man. I assume that it will stop at the boundary that you defined. Yeah. Unless you throw again out of this boundary. I don't know if that's actually true. That would be my guess as to how it works.
The way that you phrased something a minute ago made me think that you said something like you need to extend boundary, or is that true? Maybe I totally misheard that. Then all you need is the component did catch. That's like a new built-in lifecycle.
Yes. So we have this class boundary. They have this boundary component, right? So in order to use this, I need to wrap whatever piece of my application. I can put this anywhere in the component tree, but I need to add the boundary component and then have the rest of the application that might throw inside of that boundary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you wouldn't do this on all your components.
Correct.
In your components, they would use boundary.
Yes.
Gotcha.
In my experience, it does not bubble. Setting a boundary is essentially you're catching it at that level. If it did bubble, it kind of ruins the
right.
reason that it exists, because then it would break your app.
But if the boundary itself threw, it's not bubbling, but you can pass it up, right? Right. Have you done that? I haven't done that. I don't know if that actually works, but I assume it would.
I haven't done that yet.
Yeah. Okay. So Brad, nobody knows the answer. Sorry. So what is this? Well, actually, I'll show you the use case that I had for this. Zoom is always in the way. So the thing I've been working on is this little thing called Canvas, which is just this like data viz tool, which is going to run super slow because Zoom is awesome. That allows me to kind of modify visualizations using this little sidebar. I'll change some color palette here. If I open this little code panel, I realize this is probably a little bit hard to read. The important part is watch this bit of code here. So if I go ahead and change this palette, we see that this thing changed, right? So what's happening here is I'm executing some function, piping the output into the next function, piping the output into the next function, so on and so forth. And I'm using, so this is a custom expression engine we wrote. It generates an AST, and I use that AST to generate an interface. And then when that interface changes, I can update the AST and turn it back into the expression. And all of these pieces are pluggable. And on the sidebar, if I put something in here that the sidebar doesn't know how to deal with, I want it to fail somehow, right? So I'm going to put a pal in here. This actually isn't going to fail the way I want it to fail. Whoa. Yeah, totally didn't fail the way I wanted it to fail. Awesome. This is super way early preview stuff. We just released this last week as a tech preview. So crashing is kind of common right now. A better example of this. Go ahead and remove this guy. Maybe. Come on. All right, I'm going to add a little markdown thing. Markdown's a lot simpler to deal with because there's no real data here. So I can have a number of string all of them together. So I'll put some new lines in here so that shows up. When we execute we get these two pieces here, right? I've got this welcome markdown element, title, a couple of new lines, and then there's a new bit of text that it just concatenates together that just says hello. And if we look on the sidebar, there's actually two pieces here, right? It realizes that I've given it two arguments, so it generates two inputs for me. So I can change whatever in here, apply this, and that's going to update this component. However, if I give it a thing that is not a string, I'll just give it a point series, why not? And run this. We're going to see that the sidebar now fails. It's not a super exciting failure. This thing is saying, like, I don't know what to do with this point series sub-expression that you're trying to give me. This thing's not a string. I can't turn it into a string, and so it fails. But the interesting bit is what's happening in the sidebar here. So this doesn't look that different. But we see here we've got this little notification that's saying, you're trying to use some sort of argument that this interface doesn't know how to render, and so it falls back to a text area input. And I do all that with an error boundary. And what that looks like is I stole, so who saw Michael Jackson's talk on render props? A handful of you. I really like that pattern. That pattern is amazing. It's a nice alternative to higher order components. I tend to write both, so I'll export higher order component of things and then also export a render. I do the render child thing. I've read a lot of stuff about this being an anti-pattern, but I don't know. I like it. Anyway, so I have this error boundary component that is basically, it's expecting a function to be passed in instead of another component. So normally you would have your props.children. Props.children would just be some other component that we render in line. I'm expecting a function, and I execute that function, and I pass in whether or not there has been an error here. So I have this component did catch, which sets the error and error info. There's 2 bits of info come in from the component did catch lifecycle, and I just set them on this component state. And the way that I use that is I have this error boundary component, and I basically just wrap a function in that, which gives me the error and the ability to reset the error state. And then based on whether or not I have an error, I render one thing or another. This code's a little convoluted, so I'm not going to dive into exactly how that works. You can hopefully understand where I'm going with this, right? We have some error, we can recover from it, and we can render something else instead. That's error boundaries. They're pretty simple. Much more interested in the talks following this, but thanks for coming out and paying attention anyway. Does anybody have any questions about this? Yeah?
I was just going to mention, like, one thing that I ran into since upgrading to React 16 is if you don't set up an error boundary and you do throw a type error at runtime, like, it just breaks the app as opposed to, it breaks the app in a different way than it used to. So it's kind of encouraging if you do upgrade to React 16, you should set up a generic error boundary at the most top level.
Yeah, just wrap the entire application in it.
Yeah, we'll forget to do that in the upgrade process.
Yeah. It's really nice that the application blows up because it used to just fail silently. Your component would throw, and then nothing would happen, and you're like, what? Why didn't my app do anything? Like, I clicked the button, what happened? And then you open your console and you see a huge tree of errors, right? One thing that's annoying is, so with the custom batching strategy, it will, actually, previous to React 16 in general, when a component failed to render, it would delegate up to the window.error event, or window on error event. So if you have a custom on error handler that's just like, hey, something failed in my app, that will get triggered. Which sucked for us because the application that I was using is a plug-in application to another application, and that other application has a custom on error handler. So when a component was throwing, it would trigger that, the entire application would blow up, and I could not recover from that at all. So at least with error boundaries, I can recover. However, error boundaries in dev mode still delegate to window on error. They do not in production mode, but it's still a problem for me because now I still have to wrap the other on error handler with my own thing, throw a custom error, which I catch along the way, check to see if the error that got thrown is the error that I threw, And if not, then I can just delegate up to the other error handler. Super annoying. There's no way, as far as I can tell, to disable that even in dev mode. It will just always, in dev mode at least in production mode, this doesn't happen, but it doesn't help when you're trying to write your application. Other questions? Cool. That's error boundaries. Thanks. Short and sweet.